Okay, let me get started. First of all, are there any questions about the project or anything a thing we've been talking about recent times? Yes.
So I have a question about the project. So is there a way can we is there a way for us to find out if whatever plan? So then we did the progress report, and then we laid out like a plan on what we are going to do after this for the final report. So is there a way to get feedback from the TAs if what our plan is sufficient for the final report, or we should be doing more? Or can we just
Okay, so you want an evaluation on your plan. Again, supposedly that's the feedback that you should have gotten on the what you call it, when the progress reports were graded.
If that is fine, then we can assume that.
Then recognize that when the things are graded, they're not going to look at your plan to see whether you did exactly what you're saying. So, when I'm reading the progress reports, I'm trying to see, is there a sensible plan that I believe will work? Okay. And if not, I try to give the students feedback on that. Okay, and I get the sense that's what the other TAs are doing. And you know, ultimately, you have to think of you will have to think about do the best that you can. That's I guess what it amounts to. They're not going to be grading to say did you do exactly what you said on the progress report. They're going to be looking at the final document and say did you do a good project or a bad project. And so but I trust that the feedback given, especially by the TAs, is intended to guide you in directions they think are more likely to be fruitful. And if you want to talk about it, again, you guys can talk to me during, after class or something like that. Okay? Any questions? Any other questions about project or anything like that? Okay, what I'd like to talk about today, I'd like to finish up this idea of clustering, which I think is a important technique in data science for a lot of different reasons. And then hopefully get started on some machine learning stuff, because I guess the semester is starting to wind down. So clustering is, again, the idea of if you have rows of data, and also, of course, the data is typically got features, so you've got to think of rows and columns. Um, Clustering is about grouping the rows in ways that similar things, are kind of reflected. Similar things appear in the same cluster. And this is one of the picture I have on this on the slide is one of my favorite examples of clustering. What is this thing about? This shows the results of some experiments in biology using a type of data called a microarray, which for every gene in an organism, in this case it's probably yeast, for every gene in an organism will tell at a particular moment whether that gene is turned on or turned off. Genes are regulated, sometimes they are making proteins, sometimes they're not making proteins. What is this thing showing me? The rows here, the columns here are genes. So the order is a little bit backwards from what we did before. The columns are genes. The rows are expression over time. Over time. What did they do? They took a bunch of yeast cells and they synced them up. They got them all organized so they're all in kind of the same state at the beginning. And then they said go. And the cells started growing. And every 10 minutes or so, they would take some of those cells, extract their DNA, and tell how much each gene is turned on and off. And so what is the data as we move down here is time, okay, from the moment that they were first synchronized till later. And cells divide. That's kind of the interesting thing about cells. You start with one cell, then it kind of goes through some move and makes two cells. And what they did is they looked at every single gene in every single gene at every single point in time, and then clustered them by how they behaved over time. So what do we see here? If you look at this thing, red means the gene is turned on an unusual amount. Red means that the gene is turned off an unusual amount. And black means it's kind of just in its kind of normal resting state. Okay? Now, what does this show you? If you just looked at the data without any clustering, you would see a matrix of red and blue, and it wouldn't really mean anything. But this is data that's been clustered. And what do you see when you cluster it? What do you see about all of these genes? Okay, over here. They all seem to go through a state where in the beginning they weren't doing anything. Then they were turned on, and then they were turned off. Okay? Here you see some genes that were turned off but got turned on later. Okay? Here you see genes that were not that heavily turned on ever, but at some point were really turned off and then turned back on again to a modest amount. Okay? The clustering here rearranged the order of the columns so similar genes are next to each other. Does everybody see that? Now, once you look at this, how much data is this here? There are something like 6,000 genes in yeast. We have, in this case, I think something like 14 time points. Okay? To be able to see anything in such a large rate or matrix of numbers, it has to be organized. And because of the clustering, it is organized enough that you can now see patterns. Okay? And the genes that follow the same patterns must be being turned on and turned off with the same mechanism. So with this one experiment, they learned a tremendous amount about the biology of this, how the cell cycle works. And the cell cycle in you're not yeast. No one in the class is yeast. But when it comes to cells dividing, humans don't do it that much differently than yeast does. So in some sense, one experiment like this tells you each one of these genes in yeast, for the most part, has a correspondence in humans. Okay? And by looking at these clusters, suddenly you could figure out how the cell cycle worked. Okay, in ways that weren't possible without it. Any questions about this experiment? Or about what this clustering means? There may be a mystery here, which we'll resolve a little bit later, perhaps. What is this tree-like thing? If you look at this, there is a tree-like thing on top of this data. What that is actually something we'll call a dendrogram. We'll talk about that a little bit. But basically, that is a notion of how the clustering is working. Okay? The height of the dendrogram is reflecting this is kind of a merging, a bottom-up algorithm, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the height of the edge represents how big a merge, how different are the two things on the side of the merge. The final merge was all of these genes against all of those genes. And, all red versus all green, that's pretty different. And so that's why this has such a great height. Over here, when you looked at it, you had a lot of genes that were very, very similar. The cost of merging them into a cluster was relatively low, okay? And so this tree, this dendrogram, shows us something about how good is the cluster, what does the cluster structure work like? And we'll talk a little more about that later. Any questions? Okay. So why is clustering such a good thing for when you give it a data set? One thing that's good is it gives you a way to do hypothesis generation. How many different groups are in your data? Again, in that biology experiment, how many different types of regulation of genes are there? That's one thing we learned from the number of clusters. One thing is sometimes when you're trying to build a model for, let's say, classification or regression, you can imagine the features are going to be different, have different meanings on different groups. Okay? Let's say you're trying to figure out what it means for someone to be tall. And maybe if women are shorter than men on average, being tall for a woman is somewhat different than being tall for a man. Okay? You could imagine a world where you might make a more accurate model by building separate models for groups that are somehow similar, that are somehow real different groups in the population. So if you have enough training data, instead of doing regression on the entire data set, maybe cluster the data set and then build regression models on each cluster. And the presumption is you will have a more accurate prediction. Another notion of reason why you do clustering is data reduction. Maybe you have too many items to actually work with. If you have billions and billions of examples, what you would like to do is make sure you get representatives of each grouping, okay? If you're going to try to reduce the size of your data set. Well, if you do a clustering, then maybe you keep only a small number of examples from each cluster, okay? Maybe you represent each of these items in this big cluster just by its centroid, by kind of the center of the cluster, okay, as a way of reducing the thing. Outlier detection. How do you tell if an item is weird? Well, if my data looks like this, okay, where is the outlier? Okay, I think it's pretty clear that this is the outlier. How do you define it as the outlier? Well, if we clustered it, one of two possible things would happen. Maybe when we build clusters, we got bunk, bunk, bunk. We got 3 clusters and 1 cluster is tiny. That's a sign that that item is an outlier. Or maybe when we clustered it, we got 2 clusters. And when we look at the items in each cluster, this item was very, very far from its centroid. Okay, and that's a clue that that item is an outlier. Okay, so for all of these things, fundamentally, clustering is the step you need to do. Any questions? So how do you cluster? And there's, I'll say, actually, there's a huge number of clustering algorithms on the market, okay? But I'll say that today I'll talk about 2 different kind of popular approaches. Probably the bread and butter one that computer scientists typically use is something called K-means clustering. What is the idea of K-means clustering? We start by assuming that there are K clusters. Okay? We pick K points and say each one of these at random, and say each one of these points is is the center of a cluster. Then we assign all examples to the nearest center. So now we have K groupings of points. For each grouping, we will now recompute what its center is. Okay, perhaps the median of the points in that center. And then again, go through the same process of now testing all the points against these new centers, and keep repeating until ideally until no points move Okay, the centers don't change. Okay, or we're tired of doing it because we're close enough with what we got. So here is an example of K-means clustering. Okay, here we have the data set that I showed briefly at the end of class last time. And we picked 3 points at random to be our centers, kabunk, kabunk, and kabunk. Are those the right centers for that data set? Probably not. Okay, and in this case, certainly not. But what do? We start by grouping every other example by which is closest. Which one of our centers is closest? And that breaks the points into blue, blue, red, and purple, based on what center was there. Based on this, we're now going to compute a new centroid of the points. So for the blue center, now that it's got all of these other points that are now blue, the centroid of the blue shifts downward. The centroid of the red, okay, actually stayed about where it was, but maybe reached out a little to pick up this red part. The blue one shifted over to reflect the fact that there were more points over here than there were over here. Now then, we again recompute which points are closest to the centers, okay? And when we, and that then causes the centers to move. We do it again. Again, in this case, it moves relatively, the centers move relatively slowly. Here, the blue center, purple center moved over. That let this cluster be red. So the red center is going to move closer in that direction. The blue center didn't really move. It was happy. It had the same set of points that it did before. Once the red center moves over, it takes more and more of this other cluster out there. And eventually the red center moves all the way to the center of that cluster. The blue point moves over there, purple point moves there, and the blue point moves over there. Any questions about that? So the key step here is we're starting with a random assignment of points, of cluster centers, and then adjusting this in response to the data that we get. Yes?
So is there an algorithm for figuring out what points we start with? Because that would make a difference.
So the points, having the points that we start with, okay, makes a difference. Now the question is, should we start with random points, or should we think hard about what our initial points are? Generally speaking, this works by starting with random points and doing it. But if this is a fast enough clustering algorithm, we'll talk about running time again, you could try it with multiple random sets. If you have a metric for judging whether one clustering is better than another clustering, then if you try this multiple times, you could take the final result that is most satisfying to you. Okay? So generally speaking, we don't spend a lot of time at the beginning trying to find the right thing. Okay? You could perhaps imagine ways of doing that. But if you trust the powers of randomness, especially if you're going to do this a couple of times, okay, generally that's not what people do. Okay? What is the running time of this? Suppose I have endpoints, and I've decided that there are k cluster centers here. Okay? Finding the nearest neighbor, if I have k cluster centers in d dimensions, finding the the nearest neighbor to a particular. So let's say I have a world where I've got endpoints and I've got k cluster centers, and they're all in d dimensions. The key step here is for each one of these points, I've got to find which is its nearest cluster center. That means for each one of the endpoints, I've got to compare it to each one of the K points, cluster center points. Each of the cluster center points comparing the distance, if it's in d dimensions, takes order d time. So to find the nearest neighbor, every point to find its nearest cluster center takes kd time. There are endpoints, so it takes this much time to do the step of finding the nearest cluster centers. Once I have assigned every point to a cluster center, my next step is going to be to compute the centroid of that cluster. The centroid of that cluster comes from averaging for each of the d dimensions, averaging the value of the averaging the value of the dimensions. So it's something like again, I'll say certainly no more than n times k times d. Excuse me, let me just take a look at that. Okay, we're going to go through this for a certain number of iterations. Okay, because again, we're going to stop when the cluster centers when the assignments of points to cluster centers doesn't change. Okay, usually it takes a small number of iterations. Okay, until convergence happens. But if you're very, very unlucky and the points are in a particular structure, it could require an exponential number of rounds, in the worst case, till it converges. In principle, each iteration is going to be describing a different partitioning of the endpoints among the K centers. And the number of times it could repeat so an upper bound would be the number of distinct partitions, okay? But usually the number of iterations is small. So people like K-means because it's usually pretty fast. Any questions about that? And again, K-means clustering does a pretty good job. Here, remember, we have had a kind of running example where I was trying to classify people into either male or female based on height and weight. In logistic regression, when we talked about a logistic regression classifier for that, we knew what was what was the gender of each point, and we carefully designed a line that would do the best job of partitioning the red points from the blue points. With K-means clustering, if we use two centroids, if K was equal to 2, we also get essentially a linear classifier. Here was one center, here was the other. This is the perpendicular bisector between those 2 points. That kind of says that everything on this side should be in the same cluster as this. Everything on that side is in the same cluster as that. What's interesting is when we did the two-means classifier, we did two-means clustering on the gender data, this was the separating line we got. And as it turned out, because there were two populations there, the stuff on the left of this line was enriched in red points, and the stuff on the right of this line was enriched by blue points. The classifier you got by doing K-means did almost as well as logistic, almost as well as logistic regression, even though it wasn't given the genders of the points originally. And this is kind of what you would like to see happen. If there's enough structure in the points, okay, the clustering should be able to recover it. Any questions? Okay, good. Now, one thing to note is that the way that I'm telling you to do K-means now is, we're going to have a cluster center. We're going to select the points that are nearest to that cluster center. And then we are going to update the cluster center in response to it. The easiest way to update this is by taking the centroid point. That is what I would be getting. This new point here is going to be the average of the x values, comma, the average of the y values. Okay? Now, that works well if you've got numerical values. This is good because it takes time linear in the size of the data to compute the center. It's bad, though, if instead of having, numerical values, you had categorical values. Okay? So let's imagine a world where you're trying to cluster people, and you knew their height, their weight, and their hair color. Okay? Maybe in this one group, you had, a bunch of points here in height, weight, space. Maybe 60% of the people had black hair, 30% of the people had, blonde hair, and maybe 10% of the people were bald. What is the centroid of brown, blonde, and bald? Okay? Maybe bald is in the center of that, but I don't really think I believe that. Does everybody kind of see what a problem is? If we have numbers, the median is well defined. If we have points with features that are categorical values, then the median is not well defined. So how do we get around that? We can still get around that and come up with a K-means-like algorithm. I think they call it the K-Meteors Algorithm. What we're going to do is, instead of taking the the median point as a center, we're going to say our center is always going to be one of the input points. Each one of the input points had a height, a weight, and a hair color. Okay? For us to use the K-means algorithm, we need a distance function between points. And we have to assume that if you have a well-defined distance function, maybe you say a distance that two hair colors of the same have no cost, two hair colors that are different have a cost of 1. Whatever distance function you had, for any given point in the input, it is going to have a distance to every other point in that cluster, in its cluster. If we take the point that minimizes the maximum distance to another point within its cluster, that is another notion of a center. If a point is in the center of a cluster, it should not be far away from any of the other points. If we have categorical variables, by taking our examples not to be a median, but an actual example of my class, we get well-defined points, and we can proceed as before. Any questions about that?
Like select a random points from the input.
Well, selecting a random point was a great thing to do at the beginning. Selecting a random point within a cluster is probably not a great thing to do. Because if I take a random point within a cluster as its representative, then if I pick this one, it's clear that these guys are probably going to want to go into a different cluster because they're far from this example. On the other hand, if we had picked a point that was in the center of our cluster, that none of the other points were so far away from, it seems like we've made progress. Okay? And so we definitely want, again, for this to converge, ideally the center of the clusters will prove to be the right ultimate clustering center. And that the next time we did K-means, nothing will change. If we take a point on the outside, things are going to change. Okay, to get convergence, we want our cluster representative to be in the center. And either we can take a centroid if it's numerical, or we can take a point if we just have a distance function, but for some reason it can't compute centroids because they're not all numerical features. We can take a which point minimizes the sum of the distances to all of its neighbors to the cluster. Any questions? What about it?
Can we have a logical vector for categorical, for example, for black, brown, and blonde? Have three elements.
Okay, so you're saying you could have said, well, wait a second, if I wanted to encode hair color, I could have had a kind of a one-hot encoding, is what they sometimes call it. I will have, if there are k elements of the k different values that hair color can take on, I could define k binary variables, and then each one of these is going to be one or another. The good thing about that is that it would be, now it's a numerical point, and you could do the median thing. The bad thing is that sometimes blows things up considerably. Let's say that, let's imagine a point in kind of internet, let's say that we had, for each variable, thousands of possible classes. Let's think like, let's say that one of the features was the label in ImageNet. There's thousands of different labels there. If you represent your image, your thing as what you call it, your label on ImageNet as a one-hot encoding, you've now added 1,000 dimensions to the point, every single point, and you've also lost some sensitivity. So, for example, do we believe that a cat is closer to a dog than it is a house? I think you'll believe that, if you were trying to classify images, if something was labeled as a cat, it's probably more like a dog than it is a house. And you could imagine a world where if I had them as labels, maybe I could compute the distance between labels in a more meaningful way than just no distance if they agree on the label, and a one if they disagree. So sometimes it pays to keep the one, to keep the label encoding. It kind of gives you a, it can convey more meaning in a distance type of thing. In what do you mean by in here? Well, it's hard to say. It depends what my distance function was. If my distance function took into account, okay, so what do we know about bald people? Bald people are old. Okay, people with hair are young. Okay, you might imagine that you would decide that people with different hair colors are maybe closer to each other than someone with hair and someone with bald. Okay? A distance function like that, a distance criteria like that, can be computed if you have one feature that is a label. It's a lot harder to do that if you've now projected it into a one-hot vector of size d. Okay? So I agree that for small numbers of different labels, where you don't really have a sense of whether one label is closer to another, encoding it into one hot thing is a fine idea, and then you can take the median and everything's probably going to be fine. But I can easily imagine clustering problems where when you have large categorical variables that cover a large number of classes, where you do have an opinion of how far apart distance certain classes are. you're better off encoding that in a distance function directly. And then, what is likely to be the center of this? Well, if I have two things that, you can imagine having 2 points in height, weight space, and hair space. If I've decided that the distance between bald and blonde is bigger than the distance between blonde and brown, okay, that will change what the distance is between any 2 points, okay, and it will enable me to come up with a center, the one that minimizes the maximum distance to another point. Okay, that reflects my understanding of what the distances mean. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, yes.
Complexity will be higher in the case of when we find the median of each cluster than the centroid.
Finding the median point is then potentially expensive. So why is that? And here's where we now want to take a look at it. If I want to find the median, took time proportional to just the number of points times the number of dimensions. To compute the distance between every point and every other point, that's going to be n squared times d. So you're right, the downside with using this kind of meteoroid algorithm is that it becomes more expensive in each iteration to find the center. So generally we're happier with the median, but occasionally we're happier with points with categorical variables in it. So that is a trade-off. Then we can also notice that just like we talked last time about the problem of finding nearest neighbors, there are sometimes geometric tricks you could use to find what is the center point for something more efficiently than trying every pair of points. Okay? But we agree that finding the center should be more expensive. The center has to be one of your input points rather than it being a centroid. Any questions? The other issue that becomes important when it comes to K-means is that with K-means, you're making an initial assumption, okay, about how many clusters there's going to be in your data set, okay? When you start out, you're starting out picking K centers because you knew that K was you sort of assumed that K was the right number of clusters. Generally speaking, you don't really know the right number of clusters in advance. So how do we figure out what the right K really is? And I guess this comes down to evaluating how good your clustering is. So you can imagine something like the mean squared error, okay? If I have a clustering, let's say that this is my clustering that I ultimately worked out, and these are my cluster centers. The error in any clustering is going to be the sum of the squared errors, okay, of the distance between each point and its cluster center. The center is kind of going to be standing in as the representative of all the points in the cluster. We can see how happy we are by that, by judging whether or not, by measuring the distance between every point in the cluster and its center, okay? If this cluster was really tight, then the average squared error is going to be very, very small. Whereas if the cluster is quite diffuse, the squared error is going to be high. So how can we, so the mean squared error gives us a way of judging how good a clustering is. What can we do to find the right number of clusters? Well, we can start by doing experiments, try many different values of K. What happens if we try one cluster, two cluster centers, 3, 4, 5, and compute what the mean squared error is from the resulting clustering we get? Now, what's that curve going to look like as we increase the number of clusters? Okay, what's going to happen to the mean squared error from k-means clustering? Let's say I have points that look like this and this. This was my data set. What would my error be for two clusters? It would probably be something. When I have three cluster centers, is my error going to be larger or smaller for this data set? Smaller. What's probably going to happen? My guess is that what's going to happen is that if we have three cluster centers on this, even though there really are only two clusters, the average error is going to go down. One of these clusters is going to get split in half. The centroid of each half is only going to have the distance is computed to the points in its cluster. The error actually goes down the more and more cluster centers you have. So what do we need to do to figure it out? It's not like we're trying to figure out what is the K that is going to give us the minimum amount of error. In fact, it's going to, as we add more and more K, it's always, actually, hold on. TV land people, are you still there? Yes. Right, everything's still good in TV land? Okay, good. What do we want? We basically want to find where the elbow in a curve is. The error is going to go down, kabunk, kabunk, and then when we get after we get the right number, the hope is that the error is going to go down slowly. Okay? So the judgment comes. Adding more clauses, cluster centers, reduces the total error. Okay? But in an ideal world, we will find that the error goes down very fast until we hit the right number of clusters, and then goes down slowly. Okay? On this particular plot, okay, on this particular plot over here, I am showing what happened when I add random cluster centers, meaning I just pick K points at random, versus I ran K-means on a particular data set. Picking random centers, okay, adding more and more cluster centers, okay, reduce the amount of error, okay. But the important point was that when I did K-means, by the time I hit, I think it was 3 clusters, it looked like I did about as well as I would do with anything afterwards. Okay, and so this is probably a vote that 3 clusters is the right amount for that data set. Any questions? So this is a question of art, okay? If you know how many clusters there are, like if you were knowing that you were doing men and women, you know that, then that's good. If not, you should try different values and see how happy you are with each one. Any questions? Now, generally speaking, K-means does a reasonably good job. But it has problems because it wants kind of a center to represent the points. It's really seeking round clusters. When you have data with clusters that are not round, okay, sometimes K-means has trouble. It also has trouble when it has nested clusters. If you look at this structure over here, where I had a little cluster of points surrounded by a circular thing, it might very well be reasonable to want those to be two different clusters. I do think that there's something different going on between the points in the center and the points in the ring. K-means would never find it because there is no two cluster setters that are going to separate the little cluster from the thing around it. Okay? And again, this is an example which I did where, based on the example we talked about in class with 9 clusters, what happened when you ran it with different values of k? Okay? For k equals 2, it didn't quite do what we wanted, really. Kind of, I think of this data as having 3 real clusters, 3 big clusters, each of which is divided into subclusters. Okay? For k equals 2, it got a little confused. For k equals 3, it looks like it did exactly the right thing. For k equals 4, it had to break one of those clusters into something else, and it chose to break that. That's good. For k equals 5, it broke these into things and these into 5. That's pretty good. For k equals 6, okay, it looks like it did kind of something we wanted. All 3 of these were in different clusters. K equals 7, here it didn't do quite so well. I kind of like those line things, but it was unable. It broke up those clusters. For k equals 8, it broke up both the one with the 2 clusters up here and the one down here. By the time we had k equals 9, basically it happened to have done fine except for up here where it couldn't have done anything. Okay, can K-means clustering handle outliers, or should you remove the outliers before clustering? I would say K-means you can't identify the outliers before clustering. To me, an outlier is a point that is far from its cluster center. Now, could you imagine a version of K-means where you start running it, okay, for some k? You then measure the quality by seeing how far is each point from its cluster center. Maybe for points that are far from their cluster centers, you declare them to be outliers. You then throw them out and recompute k-means again. Maybe that's a reasonable thing to do. But I don't see how you can get rid of how you identify outliers without doing clustering in the first place. Any questions? When does k-means not do quite what we would want? Suppose there was no cluster structure at all. If you ask k-means, can it give me 2 cluster centers for this? It absolutely will, okay? But it doesn't necessarily reflect an actual clustering structure. K-means can get confused when the cluster, there are 2 clusters, but the variances of the 2 clusters are different. If I look at this, there is a really tight cluster here, and there is a really diffuse cluster here. If I had to draw the boundary, I would have been happier drawing the boundary probably about there, okay? But k-means, didn't really have that ability. And of course, when you give it a hard enough problem, okay, it will get caught in local minima and get confused. This is an example of what happened when you ran it on 50 clusters, where the points were in Gaussians around random centers. Often, generally, I think it did a pretty good job, okay? But sometimes you'll see clusters kind of being split or merged, okay? Just because they were too close and the k-means couldn't figure it out. Any questions? So k-means is a reasonable clustering algorithm to work with. And it's representative of a class of algorithms you sometimes hear about called expectation maximization algorithms. Okay, so EM algorithms. The kind of an idea of an EM algorithm is this kind of iterative refinement thing where you kind of proceed in a world where you're kind of estimating parameters. In our case, kind of assigning points to cluster centers. We're estimating the cluster center. And then we're going to use these assignments to later improve our cluster estimates. This is what they call the maximization method. Okay? And so I don't find the name EM very evocative. But the idea of this, try to do an assignment, make guesses, try to then make another assignment, is a good idea. And the kind of a thing that sometimes people do that has this flavor is what happens if you're trying to train a classifier where you have a small number of labeled examples, but a large number of unlabeled examples. Okay? You can imagine a world where it's very, very expensive for a human to annotate an image. But you can imagine a world where maybe you have 1 million images. You can have a human look at 1,000 of them, and then it gets too expensive. What you could do is then start by, taking your 1,000 images. Then for each one of the other images, find its nearest neighbor. That will then, and the nearest neighbor will take the label of the real example. Now you've got 1,000 real labels and almost 1 million only, decent but not quite correct examples. Maybe training something on the bigger data set is going to yield a more accurate classifier, okay, than one that was just built on the small examples. And that's kind of the same idea here that we're using. Any questions? Yes.
What about an algorithm that you sort of first you find the centroid of the points that are labeled for each class, and then you cluster the rest around?
Okay, again, you can there's infinite variants of this thing you can do. You could assign it the label of the nearest neighbor. You could assign it the label of the 10 nearest neighbors, the majority label of the 10 nearest neighbors. The basic principle here is we're going to use our supervised data, okay, to estimate labels on the other ones to give us the effect of more training data, okay? And if those representatives are the ones that we really labeled were good representatives, we can leverage that on the unlabeled example. Any questions? Okay, the other approach to clustering that's kind of important is something called agglomerative clustering. Agglomerative clustering is something that instead of working kind of top down, K-Means said, damn it, there are K clusters, here are the representatives. Everybody goes into a cluster. Instead, we're going to start trying to build clusterings by merging things. We might imagine taking our points and merging the two closest, the next two closest, the next two closest. And slowly in each iteration, we started originally with n independent clusters. And then we keep merging the two closest clusters into one. In each iteration, we reduce the number of clusters. Eventually, we're down to one big cluster, okay? This tree of merging kind of defines the order of the clusters. And if we want to, at the end, if we kept merging the two clusters together, at the end, everything is in one cluster. But if we want to figure out what the right number of clusters were, maybe we delete all the big edges. And if we delete the big edges from this, then we get a small number of distinct clusters. That's kind of the idea of agglomerative clustering. Any questions?
Like the DNA example was sort of the key.
This is exactly what was done by the biologists in the DNA example. The biologists like this kind of approach because, for one thing, it gives them a visualization. This is kind of a typical way of doing it, okay, that gives you kind of a visualization of how good your clustering is. That has value. And sometimes these clusters are quite good, okay? I don't know if I can tell you in advance, is K-means better than agglomerative clustering? It's not clear to me that I have an answer to that one way or another. I think K-means is faster, okay, depending upon what your linkage criteria is. Agglomerative clustering may well be better, okay? And again, as I talked about these dendrograms, each merging had a cost, okay, a distance between the two clusters we merged. We can reflect that by this dendrogram, where the height of the merge represents the cost of merging the cluster of these two with that. That's what the cost of it would be. The other thing to note is that what's great about a dendrogram is you get a tree of merges. Trees do not necessarily have a geometric look to them. But if you set the property that once you have a tree at the end, you look at the final merge, you put all the items on this side to the left of all the items that were on the right. And then do this recursively as you move down the tree. One byproduct of an agglomerative clustering is actually an ordering among the individual elements that kind of reflects similarity. Okay? And that's certainly useful for visualization. It's sometimes useful for other things. Any questions? The key difference, there's lots and lots of flavors of the different agglomerative clustering algorithms. Actually, it's interesting. A lot of the old agglomerative clustering algorithms were developed at none other than Stony Brook University. And in what department? Okay, the people who founded the Ecology and Evolution department, okay, which is a biology department, they developed a lot of these clustering algorithms in the early 60s because they had data. They wanted to try to figure out what species were related to what other species and yada yada. They tended to use these agglomerative clustering algorithms. What did they differ? Yes, they were from bottom up, they were merging. The key question is, what is the notion of distance between clusters? We talked earlier, when we were talking about nearest neighbors, about the fact that there are many different possible distance metrics you can define between 2 points. There are also, once you have fixed your distance metric between points, there is still a question of what is the distance between two clusters. Is the distance between this cluster and this cluster, is it the closest point between the two clusters? That might be one way to define what the distance is. We might talk about the distance between, find the centroid of the points here and the centroid of the points here, and just take the distance between that. That's a centroid distance between clusters. We might take the average cost. We take the distance between every point in the first cluster and every point in the second cluster. We compute what sum those up. That might be an average cost distance between the average. That's going to reflect the average cost between a point in one cluster and a point in the other. All three of these are natural different cost functions you might use to merge. Doing an agglomerative clustering involves picking what your notion of, let's say, the distance between two clusters is. Okay? Why might nearest neighbor, single linkage clustering, be a good idea? The distance between 2 points is the nearest, the distance between the closest points between the two clusters. That's single linkage clustering. Why might that metric make sense? Or what would be desirable about that kind of a choice? You're saying this looks like the lines that we had before. This was exactly this case. Okay? In fact, this is exactly what people do in minimum spanning tree. The nearest neighbor metric is basically going to construct the minimum spanning tree of the points. Note that the dendrogram here, again, when we think about this, sorry. When you've got a set of points, the dendrogram is an interpretation of the merging. Okay? It is a tree. The minimum spanning tree is also a tree, but it's a different tree. Notice that in the minimum spanning tree, all nodes in the tree are actual vertices of your data set. In the dendrogram, the leaves are all the actual vertices of your data set. The internal nodes represent merging events, and the cost of the merging event is kind of reflected by the height there. So dendrograms give us trees. Nearest neighbor is akin to finding minimum spanning trees, but the dendrogram is not the minimum spanning tree. It's an interpretation of the minimum spanning tree. So what's good about nearest neighbors? You learn how to compute this kind of thing quickly if you take my algorithms class. What is good about the average link criteria? But we decide two clusters are, what's bad actually about the nearest neighbor criteria? Everybody sees that if I have a cluster like this and a cluster like this, the cost of merging the clusters is going to be that, even though there are points that are far away. Okay? The nearest neighbor criteria is not going to create round clusters. The average link criteria tends to be more robust. It creates more center-oriented clusters. But it's more expensive to compute. Okay, this would have taken a constant time cost to compute the distance between them. Whereas here it's quadratic in the number of distances. A good compromise is to take the distance between clusters as being the distance between the centroids. For each cluster, we can represent it by the centroid point. If we do that, we can measure the distance between the centroids as just one thing. Merging things according to the centroid costs can be efficient and does produce rounder clusters than the other one. Any questions about that? Yes. Now, for nearest neighbor, it looks like you're saying you got to compare every pair of points, but that's not quite true. If you think back to your your computing minimum spanning trees, there are fast algorithms for computing minimum spanning trees that are not involving necessarily looking at every point. For example, in 2 dimensions, if we have points in 2 dimensions, it turns out that the minimum spanning tree is a subset of the Voronoi diagram. Okay? The subset of the Delaunay triangulation, which is kind of a dual of the Voronoi diagram. And you can compute the minimum spanning tree of n points in the plane in n log n time. Okay? So it is possible that actually for low dimensions, this kind of a thing can be more expensive, can be cheaper than the centroid method. Okay? But again, there is, in principle, it's the same cost as computing minimum spanning trees. And again, if you took a minimum spanning tree, the worst case is proportional to the number of edges. If in the worst case the number of edges is the square of the number of points, okay? And but in fact, you can sometimes exploit geometry and compute it quicker. Any questions?
Sorry for asking this, but like with the nearest neighbor, it's sort of like for 2 clusters, you take the 2 clusters, like a point in cluster 1 and a point in cluster 2, such that the distance is the minimum out of all the points. So then it's like, is there a way to directly get the distance between 2 clusters without having to check every 2 clusters?
If you really want the point between a quick way to compute distances between clusters, the centroid is in general a good representation of it. That is a constant size representation of every cluster. That is that can then be tested pretty, basically quickly. The centroid is a pretty good representation of the 2 points. It's not perfect. Again, if my cluster looked like, let's imagine a world. What would be an example where the centroid is not a good representation of my cluster? Suppose my cluster was here. I had a cluster where I had those 2 points. My centroid is here. Does everybody see that I can have a centroid but still be very far from the actual points? Okay, but that's shouldn't be a good cluster to begin with, right? The centroid of 2 points, I can have 1 point here and 1 point here. The centroid is going to be here. Yes, it is a 1 point that represents these, but it doesn't do a great job of it. Okay? If you're worried about that, some of these other criteria might be better. Generally speaking, the centroid thing is a property that's pretty fast and generally does a pretty good job. Any questions? And basically, the running time of agglomerative clustering, ultimately, you start out with each point in its own cluster. After each iteration, you're going to do a merge to reduce the number of clusters by 1. So there's going to be something like n times the number of merge, the cost of finding what is the best choice to merge, depending upon whether you use single link clusters or or average link clustering. Okay, that might be a difference between linear or quadratic time per iteration. There are optimizations that can be used to speed this up. Okay. Notice that if I had a bunch of clusters here, and I knew the distance between every pair of clusters from my previous iteration, here I have, let's call it K clusters. If I now decide to merge 2 clusters, that's going to change what distances? Merging this cluster and this cluster did not change the distance between this cluster and this cluster. It did change the distance between this cluster and that. So in general, every time we do a merge, we don't have to compute the distances between every pair of clusters. We only have to recompute the distance from the new cluster to every other cluster. Okay, and vice versa, if it's for some reason not symmetric. Any questions? Okay. So what's good about agglomerative clustering? I like it because I can see the I can see the clustering process, and I can come to, do I like it, do I not like it, even if the data is in high dimensions. One of the other things that's great about clustering is it does give me a hierarchy. And one good thing about this is that it gives me a way to take new items and classify them quickly. Suppose if we go back to, where's a dendrogram here? Suppose I have, if we look at one of these trees, this is not a great tree because it's not very balanced, okay? But if I have, if I look at this thing, if I have a new item, what cluster should it be in? Well, I can look at the beginning and decide, is my item on this side or that side of the test? By kind of taking the tree that I get, okay, I can use this tree of clusterings to quickly decide if I have a new point, which cluster should it actually be in, okay? And this is one nice thing about agglomerative clustering. Any questions? In general, what's the right clustering algorithm to use? There's a large number of different clustering algorithms and variants. From my experience, the choice of what your clustering algorithm to use is not that important, actually. Is K-means better than agglomerative clustering? I don't really have an opinion. But I do know that if you don't have the right pairwise distance function among points, you're going to get terrible clusters, regardless of what you use. And I know that if you didn't normalize your variables in a sensible way, you are probably going to get terrible clusters, okay? And these are, I think, kind of more important decisions in general that people need to worry about, rather than obsess on the clustering algorithm. Any questions? Any questions about clustering, one way or another? So visualizing clusters, again, I like to, if I have done clustering, I like to look at my clusters and whenever possible and try to get a sense of whether or not they're good, okay? Now, if the points are in 2 dimensions, okay, it's easy to draw a picture, have a plot drawn. That colored, you had points in one cluster got colored blue, the other points got colored red, okay? In 2 dimensions, it's easy for me to eyeball my clusters, okay? Now, how do you visualize points in a cluster if you have multiple dimensions? Suppose you have points in 10 dimensions. How would you view what a clustering looks like? Okay? I don't see very well in 10 dimensions. What might be a way that I would do that? Well, one way to do it might be to reduce the dimensions on your points down to 2 dimensions. Okay? Because I can view things in 2 dimensions. If I took my data matrix and I did a SVD and took the two biggest components, now I'm going to get a set of points in 2 dimensions. Now, if I colored those points according to the labels I gave them in my original clustering algorithm, if my clustering algorithm was good, I would like to think I'm going to see coherent clusters in this 2-dimensional representation of the points. Okay? So does everybody kind of see that if I did something like a dimension reduction to 2 dimensions, but then color the points according to the labels I gave them in my clustering of the full points, if my clusters were good, I should probably still see some structure here. And if I don't, then I'm going to get to be suspicious. That's one technique. Does anybody else have a favorite technique for taking the points and bringing them down to 2 dimensions? Okay. Many of you, I suspect, actually, I don't know if you know, maybe I'm suspecting it wrong. There's a TSNE. Okay. There is our techniques that my students always seem to be able to find. Okay, there's a famous book called TSNE that takes a set of points and reduces them down to 2 dimensions. It's not doing SVD, it's doing something different that's kind of weird. But still, it's a representation in 2 dimensions when we color it according to what the clusters were, according to my clustering algorithm. If I see structure there, I am happy. If I don't see structure there, I'm not happy. Notice that both the TSNE and the SVD method, the dimensions I'm getting here, didn't know about my clustering. Okay? They're still trying to capture the shape of my points. If it did a good job, I'm happy, and if not, I'm unhappy. Any questions? Yeah.
Very expensive technology. Can we, for example, among 1 million points, select randomly 10,000?
Okay, so the question is, how would you are there ways that you would do this that's faster? Okay, so you're complaining that SVD is expensive for large N, and the answer is right. If you have millions of points, computing for just visualization purposes, computing something that's 1 million cubed is going to be expensive. Okay. The other thing that's true is if I tried, what would I see if I drew a picture of 1 million points? 1 million points in 2 dimensions. I wouldn't see anything. There's too much ink on the page. Okay? So what you're suggesting is, for visualization purposes, maybe what I would do is do a random sample of my points after I have done my clustering in 1 million, of my 1 million points. To sanity check it, maybe you would take 10,000 of those points. You could then compute the TSNE plot. You could then do the SVD, okay, on that. So long as you color them according to the original clustering thing, you're probably going to get a sensible thing. Any questions? Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. That's where I'm going to leave you with clustering. Okay, so clustering is a good thing to be able to do, and either of these approaches are reasonable ways to do. Okay, thanks for your attention. Next class we'll start talking about some other machine learning methods, and I look forward to talking to you guys then. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Question about last session.
The last session. Okay, yeah.
You showed us a Wikipedia that said you are very similar to, or the most similar person.
Okay, right. Yeah.
Okay. Can I conclude that your method couldn't work for ordinary people? It just work for very famous people.
Okay, so the concern here, what you're saying is, this is what you were basically talking about. And again, in this case, I was trying to study how similar were people in Wikipedia. And you're telling me if I'm not in Wikipedia, would I be able to tell how similar you were to me? And the answer is no. Okay, in this particular study, this was built, remember, what was my raw data that I was working from? My raw data here was that I had the network from Wikipedia, right? Here, every vertex was a person's page, and there were edges depending upon whether or not there was a link from my page to your page. So in this case, again, obviously, with all of any data analysis, you can only analyze it on the people whose data you have. Okay? So in this case, you would not be able to tell how far you were from me because you don't have a Wikipedia page.
Okay, but I believe that in Wikipedia there are some of the professors of this university list.
Yeah.
So, and they are more similar to you than, for example, the founder of Google.
Okay. So you're saying that another argument, so there's one question that you may say is this method any good? Again, I'm saying that what am I saying? When I took this graph and I did the graph embedding, and I got a point for every person in Wikipedia, I said, who was my nearest neighbor? Okay? You're saying that I should have as my nearest neighbor some other professor at Stony Brook.
At least.
Okay? And that's not inconceivable. But let's think of why that might not have happened. Let's say there was a professor in mathematics. Where would there have been connections between me? Let's say Joe Mitchell. Joe Mitchell in applied math is someone very, very similar to me. We've published papers a lot together. I'm pretty sure I know he has a Wikipedia page. Okay? Why wouldn't Joe Mitchell be my nearest neighbor?
Because at least both of you has a link to Stony Brook.
Okay, so one thing in favor is that if there is a link to Stony Brook, that I am linked to Joe Mitchell through Stony Brook. If Stony Brook is one of the nodes in the Wikipedia graph, then you're quite likely I might find that. Okay, but remember I showed you examples earlier where depending upon whether or not I allow
So you drop the places.
whether I drop the non-people nodes,
yeah.
might cause it. We will agree that my chances of being close to Joe Mitchell depends on Stony Brook being a node in the graph, right? Me being close to the professor in mathematics depends on that being a node in the graph. If I didn't have the node in the graph, then there's nothing obviously connecting me to Joe Mitchell.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there is probably connections from me to computer scientists. There's connections from Sergey Brin to other computer scientists. I don't think I'm a very close match to, let me assure you, I don't think I'm a close match to the Google people. Okay? The truth is that in Wikipedia, there's not that many people, there's not that much data on a point like me. One thing that's true about my Wikipedia article is it's very short. I am barely in Wikipedia, if you want to think of it like that. Okay? Where Sergey Brin and the other guys really are close. Notice that my nearest neighbor might be Sergey, but Sergey's nearest neighbor is not me. I am kind of a point that's kind of floating outside. I'm a little bit of an outlier. They don't have as much with this kind of data. There isn't as much data about me as there would be about a more prominent entity. And so it doesn't do a great job with me. I like that picture because I like being compared to Sergey Brin and the guys who founded Google. But I don't think that, I'm not saying that that's a good job it was doing. I would say that that's probably a bad job it's doing.
Another thing, tomorrow you have seminar for
Yes, I think.
Yeah, but the problem is that at that time we have seminar from 2:40 to 3:30, and so if you could start about 10 minutes or 15 minutes later instead of 3:30, 3:45, for example.
Talk to the organizers. I didn't organize that. That was organized by the graduate student people. So so if you get them to move it, that's up to you. But otherwise, I can't tell you. Okay, thanks. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the project.
What about?
So then we are doing the one with the flight delays.
Okay.
So what we've done so far is that like we took the flight data which was provided to us along with the document,